Life is unpredictable, but preparing for the unexpected shouldn't be. Take ownership of your life planning with Policy Genius to help your loved ones have a financial safety net in case something happens to you. They offer life insurance policies starting at just $276 a year for $1 million in coverage. Don't wait for life to make other plans. Protect your family today. Head to PolicyGenius.com. That's PolicyGenius.com.
Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. Today, I'm starting a series about an archaeology project that I worked on in Italy in the summer of 1999. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with conspiracies? Isn't this a farm where conspiracies are grown? Did I see a UFO over Mount Vesuvius? Did I find the Holy Grail in the catacombs of Rome? The answer to all three questions is no, unfortunately. But if you let someone talk about conspiracy theories long enough, they will eventually start talking about ancient history. Definitely the pyramids, definitely the Bible. So, what better way to think about the past and how it relates to our future than to follow me along while I overthink my way through the summer of 1999. In this series, we're going to talk about some of the unusual people I worked with. We're going to talk about ludicrous levels of wine consumption, digging up trenches with drunken fascists, a weekend in Rome, a weekend in Naples, a day in Pompeii, digging up graves, of course, and also the mafia. And what does the mafia have to do with archaeology, you ask? Well, a lot, actually. And we'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about the history of the region, especially details about Greco-Roman culture, in particular, some of its stranger qualities. I want to give a sense of just how much we do know about Greco-Roman culture. They left a lot of writing behind. A lot of it is contradictory or silly. We'll talk a little bit about Greek art and about how art and politics and culture and religion all intersected one fateful night and caused a serious problem that we'll talk about, having to do with very anatomically accurate statues of Hermes in Athens. I want to use mostly the words of contemporary writers from the time and not excerpts from academics. We're going to hear clips from Aristophanes, and most people are not ready for Aristophanes. He's a bit shocking. He never misses an opportunity to make some sort of sexual innuendo or a crude reference to some bodily function. And we'll listen to some clips from that play. We tend to trust ancient authors more than maybe we should. When people read an article out of the New York Times from, say, 1994, they're going to exercise a bit of skepticism about the author's political motives, their career, what their beat is. However, with ancient documents, sometimes a papyrus anonymously written right out of the sand becomes headline news. I think this has something to do with something the bad guy said in Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, and maybe it stuck with me in my little 6-year-old head. Belloc, the French archaeologist who was Indiana Jones's top nemesis, he holds up a watch and he tells Indiana Jones that this watch is just a few dollars from a merchant on the street corner. But if you buried it in the sand for 1,000 years, then it becomes priceless, he said. He said men will kill for it. And one thing I want to do is pull off that veil and see ancient people more as everyday people. Look at their lives, their dreams, hopes, fears, aspirations. And I think one thing we'll find is that it's a bit of an alien culture. Pre-Christian culture in particular is strange to modern ears, even modern people who aren't Christian. A lot of times people forget how much of Western civilization in general relates to its interaction with Christianity over time. So speaking of Indiana Jones, I saw that movie when I was 6 years old in 1981. I was a little too young to have that whole experience of remembering when I first saw Star Wars. I was still a year old, and my mother said I just fell asleep through most of it and woke up and started clapping when everyone else clapped at the end. But I do remember Raiders of the Lost Ark, mainly because I may have been too young to see some of the violence, melting faces, exploding heads, and whatnot. But, of course, I thought it was the coolest thing I've ever seen. And Indiana Jones had a calm, rational, educated view of the world that Han Solo didn't. And, of course, he was handsome, apparently successful with the ladies. He knew how to run fast and ride horses and punch people and shoot a gun, but he also, similar to Odysseus, used his brain to think his way out of situations. So when the government types came to the university in the movie, I was so impressed by how Indiana Jones could just open that giant Bible and explain to them off the top of his head exactly what they wanted to know. He clearly knew all the pharaohs. He knew the Old Testament. Also, when he was in Egypt, in the map room, when he uses the staff to find the exact location of the Ark, I was inspired when he brushed the sand off of the stone to reveal the hieroglyphics that he could read without any reference. He didn't have an English to Egyptian dictionary. So when I first started UT in 1995, I entered the Plan 2 program. Plan 2 was sort of a strange preparatory program for people who would definitely be going to grad school. I eventually decided not to go to grad school in 2000. And yes, I didn't officially graduate until 2003. So that was 8 years in and out of school at UT. I had a lot of crazy jobs to pay for all that stuff. Luckily for me, they will also make for good episodes, I think. So in Plan 2, you don't really have majors. They call it concentrations. I decided my concentration for my first year would be film. Technically, radio, television, film. I worked for Texas Student Television for a couple of years, was a camera guy, did some editing, worked with a young firebrand wannabe journalist, and then I decided that I probably wasn't going to like working with anyone in the film industry or in the news media. And it maybe started to dawn on me that I would not be making a lot of material that people wanted to see. So then I decided on something a little more practical. For the next 2 to 3 years, I was focused on Asian studies. And my plan was to also get some business training and just go overseas and work for some corporation in Japan. I thought I'd be a good cultural ambassador. I also love languages, which you guys may figure out pretty quickly. I ended up taking 3 years of Japanese. Only 1 year of Chinese. Along with this, I took a lot of science and a lot of philosophy. The science and the philosophy both heavily influenced my thinking. So, unfortunately, we will need to talk a little bit about philosophy at another time. So when did all this trouble start? Well, it was late 1997 or early 1998 when I registered for a history course. Even though my concentration at the time was not history, I had to get some history in there, so I wanted to take a survey, some sort of world history course. And so I saw that there was a class on the golden age of ancient Greece that was being taught by Dr. Peter Green, who was a refined old British man. He fought in World War II. He liked to lecture just completely off the top of his head. He wandered off topic sometimes. I learned a couple of Irish jokes. But most of all, since he had lived and worked in Greece for a while, he was fluent in all the languages. He was able to bring it to life in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And I sort of fell in love again with classics. So I jumped into my Greek and Latin. I was less familiar with ancient Greek, so I started that first. That was traumatic, but the good thing is that it made Latin easier, because ancient Greek is significantly more difficult in terms of grammar. For example, Latin verbs have 4 principal parts, as they say. Greek verbs, unfortunately, have 6. So then, after a couple of survey courses, I decided to jump into archaeology. That was the next step. So I registered for an archaeology course. What's interesting is that archaeology itself is a Greek word, archaeologia, and archaios means something that's very, very old. And then logia is a construction from the same word as logos, and it means the rational accounting of or the verbal ordering of it. Hard to translate. And so the archaeology course is really where all this started. It was with a chain-smoking New Yorker named Dr. Carter, and he was a hands-off professor. He clearly was neck-deep in some sort of research project. I know that at the time he had an excavation in Crimea, which he wouldn't be able to do now because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Crimea has always had extreme strategic importance in the area. I noticed that in the news, the Battle of Kherson in Ukraine, and Kherson is a southern city in Ukraine, and it was originally a Greek colony, just like the colony where I'll be shortly in this story. I think this is a good time to stop and consider what would these ancient colonial Greeks think about all this. In the 4th episode, we'll talk about a graveyard that we found, and while we were doing the dig, I remember talking to one of the Italian workmen, who was not an archaeologist. He drove a backhoe. I was very impressed because he could drive a backhoe after drinking half a bottle of wine. And he was accurate to within an inch, and I was down in a pit right next to the bucket, so I was very nervous. But we'll talk about that later. I asked one of the workmen what they thought about someone being buried 2,500 years ago. And then you've got these smart-ass Americans. For the most part, we also had a Brit and someone who had dual citizenship in Ireland. But I asked the workmen what they would think, and he thought for a second, and he said that they would be mostly upset that we didn't know their names. They would want us to know who they were, what they did for a living, what they loved. So the silence of it was what I started to think about. The workmen referred to the dead people in the graveyard as I poveri morti, the poor dead people, or the wretched dead. Basically, dead people that you feel sorry for. The Greeks themselves had mixed feelings about their ancestors. When you read their writings, especially in the original language, you start to get a sense that this is an alien culture, but it's really just sort of this carapace that's wrapped around a biological core of humanity. So moving on to Thucydides. He is now one of the poveri morti. He lived in the late 400s BC. This was 1 century roughly after the Roman Republic was founded. But in Thucydides' time, the Roman Republic was a local phenomenon. Rome was not powerful. In the Mediterranean, the two principal powers were the Athenian League and the Spartan League, or the Peloponnesians. Our first contemporary voice is Thucydides. That's the anglicized version of his name. He was an Athenian writer. He wrote in very high literary Greek. And you'll notice he uses overly intricate phrasing. You'll also see that, like a lot of Greco-Roman writers, there is a bit of a modern sound to how they use more abstract reasoning. They use technical, political, and economic terms. And there's a bit of general skepticism toward the powers that be, and even to ancient sources, which is something you don't see in other cultures, for example, Persian, Egyptian, the Israelite culture. So just know that if in the voice clips Thucydides sounds maybe strangely modern, considering this was written 400 years before the New Testament, just know that that's why we study the ancient Greeks. They were unusual in their view of their place in the world. Now, I used AI voices to read the text. I did not choose a man with a Greek accent because modern Greek, although unfortunately spelling stayed the same, it sounded completely different. Ancient Greek was a tonal language. It wasn't a stress-based language like modern European languages, including modern Greek. It was very harsh. And so you ended up with a language that sounds like a cross between Chinese and Arabic. And then add on top of that some nightmarish grammar. So I didn't use a Greek accent because it'd be a little condescending and inaccurate. So I chose a British voice to show that, A, this guy is not American. He's from another culture, but we can understand him. Also, people tend to ascribe higher social class or education to people with certain British accents. So you'll get a sense of the class structure. So I chose one of those. So modern people just go on and on and on about ethnicity, race, nationality. Ancient people were just not that interested in those subjects. Their big thing was class. We like to pretend that class doesn't exist now, but in the ancient world it was everything. And Thucydides was of a very high class, and he'll let you know occasionally. Okay, so let's hear what Thucydides has to say.
Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out, and believing that it would be a great war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds.
You have to allow me the liberty to trim down some of these phrases. Ancient people were painfully wordy. They never get to the point. But I promise I'll only omit boilerplate stuff and repetitive formulaic stuff. For quotes from the plays, I don't edit those. I'll talk about exactly what translation I'm using. For Thucydides, I'll be using a standard translation from offline, but in later episodes, we're going to be listening to some of my translations directly from Greek, especially for the quotes from plays, because your typical Victorian translators were obsessed with making everything sound like boring, plodding, proper British English. That's not how the Greeks saw themselves. They were wild. In this first clip, he talks about his motivations for writing the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he gives a sense that his writings will be treasured for all of eternity. Didn't sound like much of a humble guy, so let's listen.
Having now given the result of my inquiries into early times, I grant that there will be a difficulty in believing every particular detail. The way that most men deal with traditions, even traditions of their own country, is to receive them all alike as they are delivered, without applying any critical test whatever. The absence of romance in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest. But if it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the future, which in the course of human things must resemble if it does not reflect it, I shall be content. In fine, I have written my work not as an essay which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time.
I think it's interesting to see how often generations see themselves at the crossroads of history. I do think that we have a much better claim to be at a major crossroads in history than Thucydides, because we have entirely new technologies that change the way we communicate, reproduce, think, perceive the world. Thucydides could not have anticipated the impact of social media or AI. Thucydides does do a good job here of expressing the skepticism that is indicative, I think, of Greco-Roman culture. And their doubts about their origin is a reflection of their sophistication, I think. They're able to allow for the possibility that they've been bullshitted by their ancestors. I think that's an important instinct because our ancestors aren't perfect. Ancient people were profoundly ignorant. Ignorant in the sense of what they didn't know about the world. The nuts and bolts mechanical facts about things like gravity or electricity. But they were extremely intelligent, profoundly clever. I think they leveraged what they knew and what they had vastly better than we do. I think modern people are helpless by comparison. I think ancient people would see modern humans as those people from the end of WALL-E, confined to those floating chairs with TVs attached and little robots to do everything they want. And they just sort of act like oblivious children. I think that's how ancient people would see us. I think in classical literature in general, we see a kind of self-awareness about the human condition that we don't see in medieval works or modern works. There's a sense that Greco-Roman people get it. They understand how bad life can be, and they understand how good life can be. They understand how disgusting and horrible people can be, but they never forget, and they never let their reader forget, that occasionally, sometimes, people can achieve greatness. Now, they generally thought that once a person achieved greatness, the gods wanted to smack them back down. The divine forces of the universe were antagonistic, for the most part, to the ancient Greek mind. The project I worked on was in South Italy, very South Italy, and South Italy had been colonized by the Peloponnesians. So note that when Thucydides talks about the Peloponnesians, he's referring to the people living in the colony where I would be doing my work. Metaponto, the modern city, was originally a Greek colony called Metapontion. Their founders were originally from a city named Pylos. These late 5th century Greeks were the middle children of the ancient world. What you'll hear from Thucydides is a sense that Homer and Moses and Ramses died a long time ago and were more or less mysteries to him, just like they are now. At the time, Egypt had long been a shell of its former self. They were ruled by Persia at the time. Egypt was never really independent after the Dark Age, the ancient Dark Age, which is considered to have ended in 776 BC. Same thing with the Israelites. King David had come and gone. The Davidic kingdom had disintegrated, and the Jews were now under the control of the Persians. For example, to give a sense of how mysterious the pyramids were to the ancient Greeks, consider that our word pyramid comes from Greek, not from Egyptian, and pyramidos was a kind of steamed bun made out of wheat, and it kind of looks like those big steamed bun Chinese-style dumplings. And you can see how a very pointy version of that would look like a pyramid. That's what Greek sailors called the pyramids. Even back then, people wondered, what the heck is going on with those things? How'd they make that? The other thing to remember is that these ancient Greek sailors were seeing the pyramids in their original form still. And they were vastly more impressive because all that brown stair-step stone was hidden under a perfectly smooth, perfectly white limestone surfacing. Someone could slide from the top of the pyramid all the way down to the bottom. And when the Egyptian sun hit that white limestone, it was blinding. There was also supposed to be a gold plating on the capstone at the very top. So the original pyramids were exponentially more impressive. You will hear Thucydides refer to the Greeks as the Hellenes, or Hellenes if you're anglicizing it. He refers to Greece as a whole as Hellas, which is what the Greeks call themselves. Graiki is a Roman word. You'll also hear this term Lakedaimon. Lakedaimon was the Greek word for the city center of Sparta. If you ever see Spartans in movies on their hopla, their giant round shields, you should always see what looks like an upside-down V. It's essentially the Greek L, and that stands for Lakedaimon. So Spartans didn't have a big S on their shields. It was the Greek L, which looks like an upside-down V. So it turns out archaeology is a little boring. At least the part that you do in the library. I immediately realized that I wanted to be out in the wild in some other country, digging up something old rather than memorizing maps or memorizing different famous pottery finds or sculptures or learning about different methods of making mosaic tiles. You have to learn all those methods because different cultures use different methods, and that left telltale marks on, for example, the cross-section of the pottery shards, and that was one way of dating and identifying the origin. The word ceramic comes through French. That's the reason for the soft C at the beginning. But, of course, in ancient Greek, ceramic was keramikos, This was originally the name of a region just outside of Athens. And we'll talk more about the special pottery they could make there because of the special clay that they found. And Athenian pottery was so attractive and well made, and made at a large scale so that it was affordable. It turns out you find Athenian pottery everywhere in the Mediterranean. So the tests in Dr. Carter's course mostly involved looking at slides and then writing a little paragraph about the find, origin, who found it, when. But there were 2 assignments that were due by the end of the semester. In these assignments, we had to choose from a set of recent archaeological papers that had been published in journals, and we had to write a response or a critique to the paper. Now, I had been taking some economics courses, and one thing I had started to notice in the classics was an overconcentration on myth and the inspirations of great people, when, as we know now, a lot of the most massive, unstoppable movements in history have been mainly caused by inflation or interest or the price of some precious commodity. So I started looking at that, and I found a paper that was written about the founding of a colony in northern Sicily called Megara Hyblaya. But I'll just say Megara Hyblaya. He also talks about another colony called Naxos. Well, this author focused a lot on the political pressures to expand. He claims that colonies were founded primarily due to overpopulation and pressure for land. Land hunger, they called it. Land was critical to pre-modern people because all true wealth was agricultural. The merchant class was fairly low on the totem pole, being a merchant, a sailor on a merchant ship, an actor, a banker, a shopkeeper, a sex worker. They were all classified as being less than. Farmers were the moral epicenter of ancient life. Farming was much more difficult, much more risky, and much more labor-intensive in antiquity than it is now. Now we're so mechanized and efficient that only about 1 to 3%, less than 3% of the population is involved in agriculture. But in ancient times, it was at least 90%. The overwhelming majority of people worked in the fields or around the house, weeding gardens, mowing fields. Dr. Carter had focused on agricultural archaeology. So I thought it would be a good idea to look at that. I found evidence that the founding of this colony was an entrepreneurial act and not political necessity. In my paper, I talked about the choice of harbor. We see references to Hyblaean honey exported from Sicily. And so I looked back and tried to examine all the different motivations someone might have for leaving their home city. The point of my paper was that these colonies were likely founded by small groups or even individuals hitchhiking along with merchant ships that are going out to Sicily, looking for a better life. Maybe instead of farming some sort of marginal land way out on the outskirts, they hoped they could find fertile and defensible land somewhere new. I think as Americans, we can see some commonality with that. And it's true that it appears that the colonial Greeks had a kind of cultural pride and identity, an adventurous spirit, and an interest in wealth that colonies in the modern period shared. One thing that is different is that colonies in the modern period were often founded specifically to exploit some sort of natural resource. This was not the motivation in ancient colonies. There were definitely cities that sprang up around a natural resource. The island of Cyprus, for example, comes from Kypros, which is Greek for copper. This was at Wagner Hall. Wagner Hall is the oldest, creakiest building on campus. And of course, that's where they keep the philosophy department and the archaeology department and classics. The classics department has its own library in Wagner Hall, sort of in the basement. It's very creaky and dusty in there. And that's where they have their Loeb library. They're these little books. They're very convenient because on one side is the original Latin and the other side is English. Same thing for the Greek versions, Greek on one side, English on the other. The way you can tell is the Latin ones are red and the Greek ones are green. And so you always see those books around because they're convenient. So I'm walking out of Wagner Hall, and I see Dr. Carter on the steps. He wasn't a very talkative man, and he was taking constant smoke breaks on the steps there. He sees me walking by, and he stops me, and he says, "I liked your paper. Write me another one like that, and you've got an A in the course. Don't worry about showing up for any of the other quizzes." So I took him up on that deal, wrote him another paper, and after reading the second paper, he invited me to come work on the project that summer in Italy, very, very South Italy, Metaponto. So I had about a full semester to prepare for the trip. First order of business was getting a passport. I had never been outside the country. I also did something that was very 1990s. I went to an actual brick-and-mortar bookstore, and I bought, with cash, a big box of CDs and some little slick printed books. And it was all about Italian. I was going to learn Italian. I was going to be super fluent when I got there. In general, from what I've learned later in life, it's a terrible way to learn a language. What I found out was, the Florentine dialect of Italian that the CDs taught you was more or less useless in South Italy. We were headed for the very bottom of the boot. And in Naples, they speak something that doesn't sound like Italian at all. So I flew from Houston to Charles de Gaulle Airport outside of Paris. It was an Air France flight. It was a good trip, good food, nothing to talk about. At the French airport, some older Frenchman with a waxed handlebar mustache, right out of some 19th century postcard. He had a gray pillbox hat. He was something official, and he was really rude to me because I didn't have the proper enregistrement, which is what I think he was saying. But I'm like, whatever you say, Pierre. I'm on my way to Italy. I don't really speak any French, as you probably could just tell. By the way, we're going to do an episode about my DNA test, where despite my French last name, I found out that I'm actually not French at all. It turns out I'm about 1/3 Scandinavian, but that's for another episode. In our next clip, Thucydides is going to speculate about the origin of the Greeks in general and Athens in particular. When we listen to this, what I'd like for you to consider is that sense of uncertainty that I mentioned before about Greco-Romans when they looked at the past, and how that's different from the what I would call Semitic or Abrahamic traditions in Western civilization that have a very firm belief in the accuracy and authority of their ancestors when they wrote down what they wrote down before the Dark Age, where other pre-modern cultures tended to see divine forces at work in the founding of their civilizations. With Thucydides, we're going to hear a Greek writer who is looking at the effects of economics. Famously, Athens could not feed itself. It could never even hope to grow enough food to support the city center in Athens. And unfortunately, that explains a lot of the complex and self-destructive foreign conflicts that Athens got itself into. The other issue is climate. Thucydides is looking at the natural world and trying to get a sense of how that would affect humans and their culture, which is a fairly modern perspective.
It is evident that the country now called Hellas had in ancient times no settled population. On the contrary, migrations were of frequent occurrence, the several tribes readily abandoning their homes under the pressure of superior numbers, without commerce, without freedom of communication, either by land or sea, cultivating no more of their territory than required, destitute of capital, never planting their land, for they could not tell when an invader might not come and take it all away. And when he did come, they had no walls to stop him, thinking that the necessities of daily sustenance could be supplied at one place as well as another. They cared little for shifting their habitation, and consequently neither built large cities nor attained to any other form of greatness.
Now, there were countries that could definitely feed themselves and actually exported wheat. One of those was Sparta. As Thucydides will mention later, Sparta did not have the urban structure that Athens did. It was inherently more agricultural, wide, flat, open farmland instead of lots of crags and dry land. Because the Spartans could feed themselves, that meant that they didn't get involved in foreign affairs the way Athens did.
The whole of Hellas used once to carry arms, their habitations being unprotected and their communication with each other unsafe. Indeed, to wear arms was as much a part of everyday life with them as with the barbarians. And the fact that the people in these parts of Hellas are still living in the old way points to a time when the same mode of life was once equally common to all. The Athenians were the first to lay aside their weapons and to adopt an easier and more luxurious mode of life. Indeed, it is only lately that their rich old men left off the luxury of wearing undergarments of linen and fastening a knot of their hair with a tie of golden grasshoppers, a fashion which spread to their Ionian kindred and long prevailed among the old men there.
By the way, that encounter with the old Frenchman was the first instance of a strange pattern I started to notice during this trip. When I was younger, I always assumed that as I got out into the world, I would find that all those old stereotypes about different cultures were not true. I'd find out the real deal. But my run-in with that French guy started to show a different pattern because, I mean, come on, handlebar mustache, gray pillbox hat, rude attitude. It's right out of a Warner Brothers cartoon. I started to see that more and more. The thing about Italians tending to gesture a lot when they speak, I didn't know how true that was. A couple of times I almost got accidentally slapped by an Italian person who was walking by me talking on their cell phone. If an Italian is in an argument on their cell phone with someone, don't get anywhere near them because you might get smacked. So we didn't stop in Rome at all. At the airport, I rendezvoused with the field director, Steve, Albert, who was the what we would call the vice capo, and Daniel, who was a grad student. He was the guy who traveled with his Irish passport. So my next real meal was going to be in Metaponto. Steve had rented a little Peugeot minivan, and we got on the highway immediately. Not the most well-built device. It broke down a couple of times just on the way down south, and it was relatively new, so we were making fun of the French workmanship of the vehicle the whole trip. I started to discover that your real archaeologists, not the ones in the movies, the people who are really into the classics and get out there and do the digging, they're the kind of people that love mundane minutiae, not so much into the golden treasures. Well, they couldn't be because Steve was new to classical archaeology. It's kind of strange. I think he had a lot of excavation experience. He had done digs in Israel on a shoestring budget, apparently, because he told stories about how during that dig they ran out of toilet paper. But of course, any archaeologist that gets to work in Israel is going to keep quiet because it's one of the best places on earth to do archaeology. Steve specialized, though, in Neolithic people. So forget all the alien-built megaliths, supposedly. An archaeologist would get excited about a papyrus fragment that describes a dispute in ancient Egypt over homeowners' insurance coverage. That's the kind of thing they get on about. Look at this. It talks about whether it covered water damage to the roof timbers due to faulty roof tiling. If you think I'm exaggerating, just wait. We had counters, little clickers, to count roof tiles when we saw them because we would graph those on a map to try to figure out where the foundations of the house would be if the roof tiles are being brought to the surface through plowing. So you have to think about how things move in the soil over time. Knowing where to dig, it turns out that is actually an important thing. It was a huge part of the plot in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it turns out that excavations are very expensive. So it helps to do your homework and know exactly where to dig. I ended up digging a couple of trenches that turned out to be for no reason at all. So it can be psychologically difficult. Okay, so obviously there was at least one apartment building in Metaponto. And it turns out there was just one apartment building in Metaponto. It's basically a place where upper middle class Italians will come down to hang out at the beach all day. In our apartment, at least, there was no microwave, no air conditioning, no internet. None of us had cell phones. In fact, the only phone, period, was a big yellow payphone that was about a block away. And I had to have these special cards to call the U.S. And there was only one convenience store that sold them in town. And it was only open from about 10 to 2 most days. So it was a quiet little place. Our apartment had a tiny little toilet, this really narrow plastic shower. Usually didn't have hot water. There was this natural gas burning device, kind of like this grate thing. I hadn't seen it before. I guess it was similar to a tankless water heater. You'd have to go in and light that manually to get a hot shower. So, as I mentioned before, Metapontion was a Greek colony started by a group from Pylos. Well, Thucydides does mention the founding of colonies in this next passage. Note that Thucydides talks a lot about population growth, which, as you can see, influenced the thinking of later scholars. I do have an advantage over Thucydides, though, as a modern person. Between the two of us, there have been much, much more intelligent people than both of us who have looked into economics, psychology, history, and they've looked at other motivations other than just the need for more land to avoid fighting. But let's hear what Thucydides has to say.
The richer soils were always most subject to this change of masters, and the most fertile parts of the rest of Hellas. The goodness of the land favored the aggrandizement of particular individuals. This created faction, which proved to be a fertile source of ruin. It also invited invasion. Accordingly, Attica, from the poverty of its soil enjoying from a very remote period freedom from faction, never changed its inhabitants. And here is no inconsiderable exemplification of my assertion that the migrations were the cause of there being no correspondent growth in other parts.
The area around Metaponto had been inhabited continuously since the Neolithic period. As I mentioned, the field director, Steve, had found some Neolithic sites in the area. So since so many people have been living around here for so long, if we were interested in this one particular era in Metaponto's history, we had to watch out for material intruding from other cultures. The Oinotrians was one group. People are not sure exactly what they were ethnically, but they seem to be living in the area before the Greeks showed up. Some people think that they are sort of a Hellenized Celtic group. There was another early group of people that predated the Greek settlers, and their material shows up everywhere, but people are not sure who they were or where their culture came from. One peculiar thing they do is they tended to make their own pottery, and they would incise it, meaning they would cut designs into it rather than paint designs on it, which is what Greco-Roman pottery tended to do. Well, I asked who were these people, what are they calling them? And it turns out that they are called the incised pottery people. Makes sense. Kind of like white dwarf or black hole, just gets right to the point. So the city center of Metaponto had already been excavated in the 1980s. What we were doing was looking for the actual farmhouses and any other structures outside the city walls. I know it might be strange to keep talking about Greek stuff when I was in Italy, but the Greek identity of the people that lived south of Rome persisted through the entire Roman Empire. There was never a time in antiquity when Greek was not the majority language in Naples or in Sicily, for example. It was not Latin. The people that lived there, of course, over time through the Middle Ages were assimilated and stopped speaking Greek. Catholicism definitely helped in the Latinization of Italy. Starting in late antiquity, the population declined dramatically and never really recovered. There are a variety of reasons for this, but economic opportunity and a lack of opportunity when it comes to agriculture is a large part of that. Now, in our last quote from Thucydides, he thinks about the future. He thinks about what will become of Athens and Sparta and how will future humans perceive them. In particular, he thinks about their ruins and what would a person much later, like me, think about Sparta or Athens' ruins after a few thousand years. Let's see what Thucydides thinks.
I suppose if Sparta were to become desolate, and the temples and the foundations of the public buildings were left, that as time went on, posterity may refuse to accept her fame as a true exponent of her power. And yet, the Spartans occupy 2/5 of Peloponnese and lead the whole, not to speak of their numerous allies without. Still, there would be an impression of inadequacy, as the city is neither built in a compact form, nor adorned with magnificent temples and public edifices, but rather composed of villages after the old fashion of Hellas. If Athens were to suffer the same misfortune, I suppose that any inference from the appearance presented to the eye would make her power to have been twice as great as it is.
So it's interesting to me to think that Thucydides is already contemplating what future people will think about them. This is a small indication that Greco-Roman culture was slightly more forward-looking than other cultures of the time. Not by much. Not even close by modern standards. We're a bit obsessed with the future. There was still this idea that the great heroes of the past were better, and that the universe was more cyclical. The ancient Greeks did not have an Armageddon or Ragnarok or some end of history like a lot of other cultures. So Metaponto does follow the pattern that Thucydides lays out here, where looking at the ruins of a place can't tell you how great it used to be. Metaponto's no exception. There are no real houses there, no suburbs. You really have some apartment buildings in the town center, and then you've got villas that are the central homes of giant farms that dominate the countryside. We spent a long time covering all the fields connected to a place called San Teodoro Vecchio, Old St. Theodore. It was kind of cool because in Spanish, they would call these things haciendas. In Italian, it's close. It's azienda. It was fun to say. So the nearest pharmacy was about 30 kilometers away. Nearest McDonald's must have been about 200 kilometers. You'd have to take a train to get any fast food. There was a big stone piazza, which is cool, and they would have line dancing and other cool stuff there. There was a big bakery. That Italian bread is very, very tough and chewy, and it's not edible about 36 hours in. There was a tiny little bank that wasn't open very often. There was a tiny little convenience store that wasn't open very often. Never saw a hospital of any kind. It was a bit of a peaceful and sad kind of place. It was peaceful because every evening you'd see these older people getting dressed up in their Sunday best to go out for a walk. Old men with pipes, playing board games. Old married couples going on walks. And then in the countryside, you did have some shepherds, and it was extremely peaceful watching the sheep just do their thing. Then at the same time, it was obviously a place that had seen a lot of suffering. I think about that scene from The Shining, where Halloran is explaining to the boy that sometimes a place itself can have a vibe, that something terrible could have happened there, and it just carries through over time and can sort of infect the people who are there. I think of South Italy as that kind of place. When you read about all the war and famine and torture and oppression over and over and over again, it's hard not to think that it doesn't leave some kind of mark, some kind of psychological thing. I think to a large extent, Italy is a prisoner of its past. So I'll end with an observation that I made in the first few days that started to give me a sense of the problems going on below the surface there. Basically, there were just a couple of streets that had shops along the way. And they were that standard European kind where they had the rolling door, kind of like what you'd have in a storage unit. And you'd pull it down and you could lock it. The bank was like that. The convenience store was like that. Well, there was one shop that appeared to be abandoned. Its door was closed and locked. And someone had spray painted in red on the door what read in Italian, "Where's our doctor?" I asked Steve about that, and he said that apparently the current Italian government was supposed to supply some sort of medical care facility and just didn't do it. And I started to learn that happened a lot. Italy, and maybe this is just South Italy, I can't speak of anything north of Rome, their government was a lot more invisible or hands-off than what I'm used to here in Texas. And so that's a question I'll leave you with because it shows an interesting intersection with the past. Because here you have this place that is feeling forgotten by its government. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's a declining place. And, of course, the powers that be are breaking their promises and they feel exploited. And it's interesting because that pretty much sums up the entire history of the place. I think you could make a good argument that this Latin versus Greek division on the Italian peninsula early on really shaped the entire history of the country and continues to this day. Ultimately, this is just something somebody spray painted on a door, but it was a first sign of an ugly mistrust that I started to see everywhere. But maybe I'm just being paranoid. Maybe I'm just overthinking things. In our next episode, we're going to go through a typical day. We'll talk about exactly who were these people I was living with, what were some of their quirks. Instead of a boring historian, we're going to talk about tragedy in the next episode. Sophocles, everyone's favorite tragedian. We'll also talk about where tragedy comes from. Well, that's it for today's episode. Make sure to come back for the continuation of the story. Talk to you later.